Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, America's citadel of free speech for 92 consecutive years. My name is Kevin Donahue, President of the Board of Directors, and on behalf of our entire board and all the staff here at the City Club, it is my pleasure to welcome you once again to our traditional Friday Forum. Our nation responded in many ways to the tragedy and horror of 9/11. After we appropriately mourned our fallen citizens, we began to direct our energies to making ourselves more secure. The Office of Homeland Security was formed. Metal detectors and searches became commonplace in major buildings and in all major airports. Slowly, life gradually returned to something resembling normal, or maybe it is more of an acceptance of a new kind of normal, reflecting the very changed world of the 21st century. Along the way, debates have raged over the loss of personal freedoms and liberty and our zeal to proclaim ourselves more secure. Thoughtful, important people and everyday citizens like you and me have asked the question, just how far should we go as a nation, as a people? How much is too much in the name of national security? Our speaker today at the City Club of Cleveland believes we haven't gone nearly far enough to protect ourselves. Lawyer, political commentator, a conservative radio talk show host Michael Smerconish argues that airline security continues to be compromised by our tendency towards political correctness. In his new book, Flying Blind, How Political Correctness Continues to Compromise Airline Safety Post-911, Mr. Smerconish argues for profiling, screening passengers based on appearance, race, religion, ethnicity, and other traits, prudent and necessary actions, or perhaps discriminatory. The answers to some of those questions and others will be addressed today by Mr. Smerconish, who is a columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News, a regular commentator on CNN's Paul Azan Now and Anderson Cooper's 360, and a counsel to the Beasley Law Firm. He currently acts as the radio talk show host heard daily on Infinity Broadcasting's Big Talker, 1210 AM, WPHT, and is an active member of the Pennsylvania Bar. He is a regular substitute host for Westwood One and has filled in for Bill O'Reilly on the Radio Factor. Mr. Smerconish has won numerous awards, including the Philadelphia Achievement in Radio Awards for Best Talk Show Host and Best Evening Program, Philadelphia Magazine's 2004 Best Radio Talk Host, and a nomination for the 2003 Radio and Records Best Local Talk Show Host. For what promises to be quite a provocative forum, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the City Club Forum and this podium, Mr. Michael Smerconish.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kevin, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is a tremendous honor and privilege for me. One never forgets a letter of invitation to come to the City Club of Cleveland. President William J. Clinton, President George Herbert Walker Bush, President Ronald Reagan, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, Dr. Henry Kissinger, talk show host Michael Smerconish. Please tell me that with regard to this obvious error in judgment, that the head of the booking committee has not been terminated. The invitation comes as well with the brochure, the City Club of Cleveland, and I've done some research as to the history of this prestigious organization, and I know that you bill yourself as a citadel of free speech, and I know that to be the case because I only know one person in Cleveland. That is, prior to coming here today, that's Avery Friedman. And I know Avery because we've appeared together on CNN on many occasions debating issues. We agree on absolutely nothing. So for Avery to have played a role in the invitation process, I know well that it is indeed a citadel of free speech, and I'm honored to be here. I'd like to tell you about a book, Flying Blind, that I never set out to write. And it's timely that I should be here because the events that gave rise to this book commenced 1 year ago at this time. I've spent my entire life in the city of Philadelphia. My wife and I have 4 children. They're 4, 7, 9, and 16. And we have a home in Florida. And 1 year ago, at about this time, we were traveling, as we often do, to Florida for spring break. I was upset with what I considered to be poor service from U.S. Air flying out of Philadelphia, and radio listeners had encouraged me to instead fly from Atlantic City, New Jersey, to the west coast of Florida via Spirit Airlines. And so I decided that we would give that a try, and that's how approximately a year ago, the Smerconish clan, the 6 of us, found ourselves at Spirit Airline in Atlantic City, New Jersey. We arrived and checked in at the curb with our e-tickets, and a very pleasant woman who was there in the employ of Spirit Airlines wanted to know, who's Michael Jr.? I pointed in the direction of my 8-year-old son with his Pokemon backpack and his Game Boy in his hands and a little bit of ketchup on his chin, if I recall, and I said, well, he's right there. And her face told me that she was having some consternation as to what now confronted her, and I said, is there a problem? And she said, well, he's been selected for secondary or random screening. And I said, if you'd like, I'd be thrilled to take his place. I'm not sure how. Oh, she said, would you do that? And I said, of course I would. And so that's how, when we left the ticket counter, I was the one walking with a boarding pass with a big red X on it as we now approach the magnetometers. Now, we own a home in Florida, and that means that we're able to travel light. We don't even have to take clothing, and on this particular day, I remember so well, I was carrying a cloth briefcase, and literally the only thing inside of it was Sean Hannity's then new book, Deliver Us from Evil. So you can imagine, when I'm now the individual who's selected for the secondary screening and I've got to go through everything, and they open it up and the only thing is the Hannity mug staring the TSA person in the face, it made for an amusing moment. But we continued on without incident, flew to Florida. While in Florida for a week, I stayed on the air for my radio program in Philadelphia. And I'm able to do so via a sophisticated telephone line which runs into a box that's called the Comrex Matrix. Now, I tell you this for a reason. There were technical issues that week in Florida. And the engineer for the radio station said, when you come home, would you please bring with you the Comrex Matrix? Now, to the uninitiated, the Comrex Matrix looks like the nuclear football that I imagine they always carry when they're traveling with the President of the United States. We arrived at the Fort Myers airport. It's now time to come home to Atlantic City, New Jersey, again via Spirit Airlines, and there's a repeat of what had transpired in Atlantic City. Who's Michael Jr.? That would be my son. He's over there. Why is this a problem? Secondary screening. Would you like me to take his place? So now, as I'm walking curbside at Fort Myers with the red X, it occurs to me that I'm carrying the nuclear football, and I say to my wife, would you mind you carry my briefcase so that when they stop me, we'll be able to move more rapidly through the whole process. And that's exactly what we did. Now, I didn't complain about it. I didn't whine. I didn't say or do anything, didn't write a letter to the Congress. I just said to myself, it seems ridiculous to me. But perhaps it's the small price that we all pay in the war on terror. And immediately thereafter, the 9/11 Commission televised hearings began. And there was a hearing in particular that caused me to start to think differently about this entire episode. And I think you'll recall this particular hearing. It was 1 year ago today, April the 8th of last year, that Condoleezza Rice, Dr. Condoleezza Rice, testified publicly in front of the 9/11 Commission. And this was an issue on which I had disagreed with the Bush administration because the administration dragged tail, so to speak, in producing Condoleezza Rice in a public setting. And I always thought that was a mistake. I well understood that she'd already testified 4 or 5 hours behind closed doors, but I thought that she owed it and the administration owed it to the American people to offer that testimony publicly as well. When she finally testified, the eyes and ears of the nation were captivated with a particular exchange. It was Richard Benveniste who was questioning Dr. Rice about the PDB. Do you remember this? The President's daily briefing. What did he know, to quote Howard Baker, and when did he know it? About a month prior to 9/11, it turns out there'd been a presidential daily briefing that had been captioned, Bin Laden determined to attack within the United States, and this was the first occasion on which the title of that PDB became known. So consequently, the news that night and the headlines the next day were all dominated by the PDB. But that was not the subject of my focus on that particular day. I was captivated with the questioning of Dr. Rice by another member of the 9/11 Commission, John Lehman. John Lehman, a Philadelphia man, product of St. Joseph's University in my hometown, someone to whom Ronald Reagan turned at age 38 to be the Secretary of the United States Navy, and a person who was put on the 9/11 Commission not by the Republicans, not by the White House, I should say, and not by the Democrats, but by John McCain, who wanted an independent set of eyes and ears on the 9/11 Commission. Each of the 9/11 commissioners were afforded 10 minutes of questioning with Dr. Rice, and I want to remind you of how John Lehman utilized his 10 minutes of time.
Were you aware that INS had been lobbying for years to get the airlines to drop transit without visa loophole that enabled terrorists and illegals to simply buy a ticket through the transit without visa waiver and pay the airlines extra money and come in? Were you aware that the INS had quietly, internally, halved its internal security enforcement budget? Were you aware that it was the U.S. government established policy not to question or oppose the sanctuary policies of New York, Los Angeles, Houston, Chicago, San Diego for political reasons, which policy in those cities prohibited the local police from cooperating at all with federal immigration authority? Were you aware, to shift a little bit to Saudi Arabia, were you aware of the program that was well established that allowed Saudi citizens to get visas without interviews? Were you
The reason that I wanted to remind you of this line of questioning, and I've taken the liberty of editing out Dr. Rice's responses because they were really nondescript, and I don't say that in a negative way toward Dr. Rice, but she didn't offer any information that was particularly significant. But he wanted to tell a story. And the story that he wanted to tell was a story of great continuity between 8 years of the Clinton administration and the initial 8 months of the Bush administration. The point being that there was very little difference between the policies of the two administrations, and let's get away from all of the partisan bickering on these issues. But then came this question from John Lehman to Dr. Rice.
Before I go to Justice, were you aware that it was the policy, and I believe remains the policy today, to fine airlines if they have more than 2 young Arab males in secondary questioning, because that's discriminatory?
Wait a minute, I said to myself. What did he just ask? Are you aware of the fact that you can't, in an airport security context, single out more than a certain number of individuals of a particular ethnic stripe at once because that's discriminatory? And as I sat in my Barcalounger watching the testimony that day, I said to myself, well, wait a minute, 4 of those planes, three of the 4 planes, pardon me, on September the 11th had 5 terrorists on board. They were of the same particular ethnic stripe. Is this to say that if I had been working in airline security on September 11 and knew that these 5 individuals now approaching me were up to no good, I could only have singled out 2 or 3 at a time because otherwise I'd be discriminating? Makes no sense. The next day in the newspaper, nobody wrote about this. It didn't make the evening news. There was not a word of it on the radio. So I tracked down Secretary Lehman, and I remember the interview so well because it took place on Easter Saturday, and I had to come in on Saturday to record the interview, and we had some technical issues where the sound quality wasn't as strong as it normally is. I caught up with him on his farm in Bucks County in suburban Philadelphia. If you hear the entire interview, and there's a CD in the back of the book of all of the sound cuts that I'm playing for you now and much, much more, you'll literally hear livestock in the background. And I tell you that because better to have the livestock than to have all the handlers. There were no handlers. He was in a good mood, and he was only too happy to answer my question about why he'd posed that issue to Dr. Rice. You said something to Condoleezza Rice. Is it the policy of the Justice Department to fine the airlines if they have more than 2 Arab males in custody? What were you talking about?
Testimony a couple of months ago from the president's past president of United Airlines and the current president of American Airlines that kind of shocked us all. They said under oath that indeed the Department of Transportation continued to fine any airline that was caught having more than two people of the same ethnic persuasion in a secondary line for questioning, including and especially two Arabs. That's really the source, because of this political correctness that became so entrenched during the 90s and continues in the current administration, that no one approves of racial profiling. That's not the issue. But the fact is that Norwegian women are not, and 85-year-old ladies on aluminum walkers are not the source of the terrorist threat. The fact is, our enemy is violent Islamic extremism. And so the overwhelming number of people that one needs to worry about are young Arab males. And to ask them a couple of extra questions seems to me to be common sense. Yet, if an airline does that, in the numbers that are out, that are more than proportionate to their numbers in a particular line, then they get fined.
Kevin mentioned at the outset in introducing me that I write a column for the Philadelphia Daily News. I'm normally afforded 650 or 700 words every Thursday, which I mention just as a frame of reference, because on Easter Sunday, one day after conducting that interview, I sat at my computer at home and I typed 2,500 plus words about my interview with Secretary Lehman and what he told me about the role of political correctness. My story led the Philadelphia Daily News the next day. And on that particular day, it then was launched into cyberspace. And that which I had written appeared in the New York Post and National Review Online, and all of a sudden came the television invitations to now talk about not what necessarily I believed, but what Secretary Lehman had told me about the role of political correctness in this process that caused my 8-year-old son to be singled out for secondary screening. And by the way, I'm walking you through this logically because, chronologically, I should say, because my whole experience, as I started, I said I never set out to write a book. This experience was a combination Forrest Gump, Michael Moore. Forrest Gump in the sense that I continually found myself in the right place at the right time to be able to ask newsmakers questions. Michael Moore in the sense that I took advantage of the opportunity, only I had manners. Now, the first invitation that came to me was to do Kudlow and Kramer on CNBC. This is going to be cut 5. Let me just give you a little taste as to how the segment with Jim Cramer began on national television.
All right, joining us now is WPHT's Michael Smerconish, who's a terrific and insightful columnist. I read his piece that was in the New York Post, but I know it's also in the Philadelphia papers. Michael, could you please explain to me whether political correctness got in the way of finding, perhaps even stopping, what happened on 9/11?
It would appear, and thank you for having me back, Jim, and hello, Donnie. It would appear that, yes, that's the case. It's horrific, but yes, political correctness has sacrificed the security of the airlines.
All right, well, Michael, who are we more afraid of? Are we more afraid of certain Arab representatives who
I'm
might
not going to play the whole cut
system
for you because my time is limited, but you get the gist of how the segment transpired. It was about an 8-minute segment. The following night, I had one of those moments where you know precisely where you were when it occurred. In my case, I was getting out of the shower. And the phone rang and someone, a relative from Florida, said to me, "Boy, did you get trashed tonight on CNBC?" And I said, "No, I was on CNBC last night, and I don't think anybody gave me a drubbing." No, they said. "Tonight on CNBC, Jim Cramer read a statement about you that had been issued by the Department of Transportation." I had to track down the tape because the DOT refused to give to me a copy of the statement they allowed to be read on national television. Here's what Jim Cramer told his national audience about me the night after I was on television.
Michael Smerconish, a Philadelphia radio talk show host, appeared on KNC yesterday and criticized what he said was the government's policy of fining airlines for searching too many of the same kind of suspicious people. The U.S. Department of Transportation sent us the following statement in reply. Michael Smerconish's recent column has not received much coverage because it is wildly incorrect.
Wildly incorrect is the way their statement began about me. I was terribly embarrassed. I hadn't invented any of the data on which I'd relied. I was simply repeating that which I'd been told by a member of the 9/11 Commission. And now fate intercedes at a moment when I'm concerned that perhaps I've misstated exactly what the situation is. Southwest Airlines was launching in Philadelphia. And the day after my appearance, or 2 days after my appearance on Kudlow and Kramer, I was asked by the radio station if I would welcome Herb Kelleher, the chairman of Southwest Airlines, at a business person's breakfast. And the drill was for me to broadcast from a corridor outside of a large ballroom in Philadelphia where 500 business people were then going to welcome Herb Kelleher. I was supposed to take an extended commercial break, run in, get behind the podium, introduce him, go back out and continue with my show. And in leading up to introducing Herb Kelleher, I was to, give the rah-rah presentation. We're so thrilled that Southwest has come to Philadelphia. But with the chairman of Southwest Airlines in front of me, and with fresh in my mind this notion that the DOT is saying that I've said something that was wildly incorrect, I couldn't resist raising the issue.
Do you mind if I hit you with an unrelated to the goodwill sort of conversation we're having and ask you a 9/11 question?
Not at all.
All right, because, and this is interesting, in the 7 o'clock hour, and I've got to be mindful of the time so that we stay on schedule, but this is so darn important. In the 7 o'clock hour initially, I had John Lehman, former Secretary of the Navy,
Yes.
who's a member of the 9/11 Commission, on the program. Lehman, last week with Condoleezza Rice, is asking her a series of questions, and he says to her, were you aware at the time that you came into office as the National Security Advisor that there was a policy in place, and I'm paraphrasing her, but he said where if the airlines singled out more than 2 individuals of a particular ethnic stripe at one time for questioning, they ran the risk of being fined by the Department of Transportation. And Condoleezza Rice said that she'd never heard about that. I interviewed Lehman later, and I said, Mr. Secretary, what the heck were you talking about? And he said, political correctness has become so pervasive that the airlines have been operating under a threat that if they didn't handle their screening in a PC manner, they could get fined. Have you ever heard anything about that?
Yes, I have. As a matter of fact, it goes back to the Clinton administration where the Justice Department said that they were concerned about equality of treatment with respect to screening, and my understanding is that that's why the random element was put in. In other words, where you just choose people at random as opposed to picking them out for some particular reason. And that, of course, caused a great many more people to be screened. And
Just so we don't offend somebody else.
well, I think that was the root of it, yes.
It's insane.
Yeah.
I mean, I had
I've got the
Senator...
chairman now of a major airline telling me that what John Lehman said to me in the interview was accurate. So on one hand, it's Secretary Lehman, it's the chairman of Southwest. On the other hand, it's the Department of Transportation saying that I'm wildly incorrect in the things that I've been saying about the subject. And all I can bring to the table is my own personal experience of what I considered to be the waste of resources in pulling my 8-year-old son out of line. And that's really where the book begins. Because now I decide that I'm not an expert on airline safety and security. I consider myself to be a street-smart guy from Philadelphia. But I set out to do something as a lawyer that perhaps I should have done at the outset, and that was to procure the litigation files from the Department of Transportation to find out precisely what are they doing in a post-9/11 world vis-a-vis the issues that have now been raised in these different interviews that I've been doing. And what I found horrified me. I found that United and American Airlines, the 2 airlines that were victimized on 9/11, the 2 airlines that lost 2 airplanes apiece and more than 30 of their personnel on September 11, were fined $1.5 million each by our Department of Transportation in the aftermath of September 11 as they sought to prevent a repeat of what had transpired on September 11. Now, the Department of Transportation doesn't like it when I use the F word, the fine word. They say, well, it wasn't a fine per se. These were settlements of litigation, and that money is now being paid by the airlines into what I call a kumbaya fund for so-called sensitivity training. The fact remains there was litigation against United and American, and they were forced to pay $1.5 million each for what? Well, the fact patterns are all repetitive, and the fact patterns are circumstances where, in the aftermath of 9/11, the following plays itself out. You have a pilot in this untenable position of being charged with responsibility for both flying safely and leaving the gate on time, because now we're all cognizant of who the most on-time airline might be. The pilot also has a statutory obligation to see to it that anyone who's perceived to be, here are the words from the statute, inimical to public safety are removed from the aircraft. And so the scenario that plays itself out in the aftermath of 9/11 is that the pilot's ready to push back from the gate, and all of a sudden someone from the flight crew or an air marshal or from law enforcement on the ground approaches and says, "Captain, there's a fella in 3C. There's a report by another passenger that he's acted in a suspicious fashion. We think but are not sure that his name is on a federal watch list, and we're wondering what we should do." And to the extent that the pilot, the captain, says, "I'd like you to question that individual further," our government regards that as a case of discrimination. Those are the fact patterns that caused the fining of the airlines $1.5 million each that were victimized on September 11. I have to be mindful of the clock because there's so much information I wish to impart while I'm here in Cleveland. At the same time that fines are being assessed against some airlines, others are being held on a pedestal. By way of example, September 21, this is from the appendix in my book. All the documents on which I rely are appended to the book itself, so you can see exactly where I received my data. On September 21 of 2001, a memo is sent to all Delta employees. It's from Frank Reed, who's the president and COO, and its caption is RE Tolerance. It says, "Dear colleagues, last Tuesday's tragedy has affected us in ways that would have seemed inconceivable as little as 2 weeks ago. Unfortunately, we've seen some Americans become suspicious of people of other cultures, especially those of Mideast descent. And across the airline industry, we've heard stories of passengers being deplaned because of their skin color or the sound of their accents. We cannot afford to follow this tragic behavior. It's exactly what our enemies are striving for, the end of our open, diverse, and tolerant way of life." The Department of Transportation, under the direction of Norman Mineta, was so impressed with the company-wide memo sent to all Delta employees that the DOT sent this to all airline personnel under the sun and said, "Emulate Delta in a post-9/11 world." I tell you this because it was American and United stung for $1.5 million each initially, and then it was Continental $500,000, and as my book went to press last summer, $900,000 Delta. The same Delta that had been held on the pedestal by the DOT now was on the receiving end of a similar fine. What's the origin of this mindset? The origin of this mindset initially, in large part, is the handiwork of Norman Mineta, a Clinton holdover now serving in the Bush administration, remarkably and distressing to me, still serving in the Bush administration, a man who was unfortunately a part of the internment process of the Japanese during World War II, who carries with him the scars of that process and tells very eloquently a story in public settings about the day that he had his baseball glove in his hand and was wearing a Boy Scouts uniform when there was a knock at the door and individuals had come to essentially round up his family. Norman Mineta has employed something called the but-for test in the Department of Transportation, and what it says essentially is that to the extent you, in doing airport screening, have relied in any way on the commonalities of those hijackers on September 11, you've discriminated against them, and if, but for any of those characteristics, you would not have singled them out of line, you've discriminated. The premise of my book is not to say that bald white guys from the suburbs get a free pass at the airlines. The premise of my book is to say that everybody is deserving of some level of review in a post-9/11 world, but some more than others. And it's funny, the book is a book about political correctness. My publisher got politically correct with me because On page 17 of my book are the mugshots of the 19 hijackers. This is what I wanted to be the cover of the book. The publisher wouldn't do it. They said people will feel uncomfortable walking around, particularly the airport kiosks, with that image tucked underneath their arm. And I said, but people don't even need to read the book if they look at that cover. And they said, well, that's one more reason why we shouldn't have that as the cover of the book. The premise of the book is to say that on September 11, 19 individuals who had their race, their gender, their religion, their ethnicity, and yes, their appearance, committed these acts upon the United States of America. And to the extent that we're not permitting law enforcement to take that information into account, I think puts us on a disastrous path. I tell the story in the book of what I call the real story of Flight 93. Flight 93 is the flight that crashed in a field in western Pennsylvania. Flight 93 can be distinguished from the other 3 flights on September 11 for 2 reasons. One, that flight didn't complete its mission from a terrorist standpoint, and secondly, it was shorthanded, if you will, from a muscle standpoint for the terrorists. In other words, there were 19, not 20, on September 11. Were there to have been 20 terrorists on September 11? There were. Was there to have been a 5th hijacker on Flight 93? Presumably, yes. Do we know who that individual would have been? We think we do. And when I say we, I'm relying on the 9/11 Commission. Who was it to have been? In all probability, a fellow by the name of Mohammed Khatani. What happened to Khatani? Khatani was a Saudi national who comes to the Orlando International Airport on August the 4th of September 01 and is stopped by a very astute INS agent by the name of Jose Melendez Perez. You know, the shame of all of this is you can't find Melendez Perez's name in the 900 pages of the 9/11 Commission report. I applaud the work that they did as far as they were willing to go, but they totally took a pass on the issues that I'm raising here today. Melendez Perez told the 9/11 Commission on a day that he received a standing ovation from the victims' families who were present that he sized up Mohammed Khatani on August 4th at the Orlando International Airport, knowing that he was a Saudi national, and said, quote, "He just gave me the creeps." There was something about this guy that I just didn't like. And that's what caused me to put him through an additional level of questioning. Remarkable that he wasn't fined or fired as a result of the way in which he approached the problem. But that's the latitude that I'm seeking in Flying Blind. I interviewed Jose Melendez Perez after the book was published. Here's a little taste of our conversation. This is cut 15.
The reason that he got in the radar screen, because remember, we have a lot of we even have a flight coming out of Saudi Arabia during the summertime, people coming down to visit. The reason that he got in the screen was because when I went to the secondary waiting room to pick him up to take him to the secondary interview office, he just gave me this stare look. I mean, he was staring my eyes like, it was very scary way that this guy looked at me. When he looked at me that way, I decided to look into with more details on the documents that he presented. At the same time, I noticed that he didn't have a return ticket or he didn't have the airline reservation. Now, it comes to mind that a guy that doesn't speak any English, how he going to get around to, to take care of business?
You're using some street smarts.
That is correct. That is correct. And also, I'm trying to put in place my training in the military and interview technique when the guy started giving me, the body gesture.
You thought he was military trained.
That is correct.
Ladies and gentlemen, I need to conclude my remarks, and I want to say just 2 additional things, if I may. All along the way, I kept Pennsylvania's senior United States Senator Arlen Specter in the loop as to what I was learning about this subject. He was incredulous as I told him initially about what John Lehman had to say, and I walked him through the process because we have a good and close relationship. Ultimately, Senator Specter called a hearing of a subcommittee for the Appropriations Committee on which he is a member, and I was able to testify in front of the United States Senate on the matters that I've just brought to your attention. It was a remarkable experience because the Department of Transportation was represented there, so too were the airlines. And it gave me the opportunity to air all of the things that I've been saying to you in even more detail. I felt so strong about the ability, about the limited ability that I had to try and do something about this that I decided to write the book. And in deciding to write the book and realizing that the program doesn't reach a national audience, it reaches a tri-state audience in Northeast Pennsylvania, I thought that it would give me a vehicle to effectuate some change. That's why I wrote the book. I never wanted to profit from the book. I never wanted anybody to be able to say that I'd lined my pocket by talking about these issues, because I'm a one-armed paper hanger from Philadelphia trying to change this policy. And that's why the last thing that I want to tell you is that I've made $20,000 on the book so far, and every penny of the $20,000 has already been given to a 9/11 charity in the community where I grew up, which is Bucks County, Pennsylvania. That particular county, which is commutable to New York City, lost 17 of its residents on September 11. So my 20K, putting my money where my, you can tell by now, big mouth is helping to build what we call the Garden of Reflection in suburban Philadelphia. This is a great privilege for me. I respect greatly the opportunity. Thank you, Avery. Thank you to everybody connected with this fine institution. I know we don't all agree on this, but it's a great country when a fellow from Philadelphia can come in and we can have this sort of candid dialogue on a matter of such importance. So thank you very, very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're listening to Mr. Michael Smerconish, radio talk show host and author of Flying Blind, How Political Correctness Continues to Compromise Airline Safety Post 9/11. We'll be returning to our speaker in just a moment or so for our traditional City Club questions. We encourage you now to formulate some questions for our speaker while we break for just a few announcements. We welcome all of you today, especially those of you who are our guests. We hope you will join the City Club and become active in our ongoing civic dialogue. We also welcome those listening to WCLV 104.9 FM on Fridays at 12:30 and on WHK 1420 AM Sunday night at 11 p.m. Radio broadcasts of the City Club are made possible through the generous support of Case Western Reserve University. Our television broadcast partners are WVIZ PBS, Iodea Stream, and Adelphia Television. Television broadcasts are supported by National City, John Carroll University, and the Nordson Corporation. We thank those fine institutions for their support of what we do here. With us today are guests at our City Club President's Table, which is sponsored by the law firm of Tucker, Ellis & West. Each month, we invite these guests to join us for the Friday Forum Experience as a way of introducing them to these excellent City Club programs. We hope they'll join us in the future, and we thank Tucker, Ellis & West for their support. We would also like to welcome guests at a table hosted by WPHT AM in Philadelphia. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today as well. We're pleased to welcome to our forum students who are here as part of our City Club student program. Participation of these students is made possible by generous grants from the Freddie Scholl Foundation. Bernard L. Carr, chairman. With us today are students from Early College. Will our student guests please stand so we can welcome you and congratulate you for being here. Nice to have you here. Thank you. Now we'd like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions, and again, please, questions only from everyone, including our guests. Holding the microphones today are membership manager Marcella Brown over on this side of the room and our marketing director Missy Toms over here. May we have our first question, please, from Michael.
Michael, in your book, you talk about most of the things that were, if 9/11 incident happened, none of that secondary would have helped, because all of the people who did that did not comply or would not have been able to show any of those things. They used box cutters, which was under those rules, were allowed. But my question to you is that most of the people who have suffered because of 9/11 are the even non-Muslims for that sense, the Southeast Asians, the Sikhs who wear a turban for religious reasons, or the people from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, who looks like the dark complexion. They have been shot at, they have been killed, there have been all kind of things have been done for the sake of security, for their sense, by the people who think that's by killing them that somehow they're avenging the deaths of all those 3,000 people. This airline industry has changed the whole thing. They don't have secondary checking anymore. They don't do any of those things that you talk about in your book. I had a long conversation with the ICE, which is called, I forget the thing. But the point remains, what your book says now does not apply to the current situation. How do you explain that?
I want to introduce you, sir, to the producer of my radio program. She's in the back of the room, and I want her to stand. Her name is Teresa Skornovaki. Take a good look. That's all right. I'm introducing her for a reason. Stay standing for a moment. Mid to late 30s, husband, similarly, 9-year-old daughter. A week ago, flying home from Hawaii, entire family, including the 8-year-old daughter, singled out for secondary screening. So I disagree with your assertion that these things don't take place any longer. She bears no resemblance in any manner to anyone connected with September 11, and she represents to me a waste of resources that should be better concentrated on folks coming from Saudi Arabia, where 15 of the 19 hijackers had their origin. Are unfortunate incidents occurring because our poorly trained TSA representatives don't know the difference between someone who's coming from India and someone who's coming from Saudi Arabia? I'm sure that's the case. They should be better trained. But to turn a blind eye, hence the title of the book, toward those commonalities of the 9/11 hijackers, to me, is foolhardy.
Were you able to, when you appeared in front of Senator Specter's subcommittee, were you able to convince them that they need to begin to change these ridiculous policies?
Everyone pays me lip service. It's amazing. Because of time constraints, and I do hope that you'll take a look at the book, you'll see that I've spoken as part of my ongoing look at this subject with the likes of Mayor Giuliani and Tory Clark at a time when she was a spokesperson for the government. I testified in front of the Senate. I interviewed John Mica, the head of the House Aviation Subcommittee. And I can't find individuals who don't say to me, what you say makes a great deal of sense. But the P word is a dirty word, and no one wants to be associated with it. And consequently, I'd love to be here at the City Club of Cleveland and take credit for changes that have been made in a post-9/11 world, but I can't. Everyone seems to agree on a visceral level, but no one's willing to carry the mantle for the sort of change that I'm talking about. And let me be specific. The type of change that I'm talking about is to simply free the hands of law enforcement, not only at our airports, but also at our borders, and allow them to take into consideration the very same sort of aspects that law enforcement use on a day-to-day basis in all facets of trying to keep us safe. Are civil liberties going to be injured in the process? In some instances, they probably will. I'm not here to tell you that it's going to be a perfect system, but it's far better than the one that we have now, which is a joke. Come on, Avery, you're not going to let me get off the hook sooner or later.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Two-part question. First of all, has the federal marshal program that was severely cut back prior to 9/11 been adequately restored? And secondly, why, in light of the tolerance of the American public to the severe erosion of our constitutional rights under the Patriot Act, why should the government be so concerned about political correctness in this area?
I don't know that I understand. If you'd stay with that gentleman for a moment, ma'am. I'm not sure that I understand the second part of your question.
It seems that the American public is willing to pay the price for the war on terrorism, or whatever you want to call it, in severe changes to our constitutional rights under the Patriot Act. Why should the government be so worried about political correctness in this area? In other words, it seems like a trivial change in our constitutional rights or
I don't think
attitudes.
now I do understand your question. At least I think that I do. I think what you're saying to me is we've sort of opened the door vis-a-vis the Patriot Act. Why should we now be closing it on such trivial matters as political correctness? Your question presupposes that the American people won't stand for what I'm describing. I think the American people will stand for and are prepared to tolerate the sort of things that I'm talking about. It's our elected officials who are scared to death to be identified with the P word that won't allow this to come into place.
My name is Avell Carey. I'm from Early I'm from Early College, and my question is: since 9/11, we have had a lot of sacrifices as far as personal freedoms, and I was wondering if you could like imagine a system whereas there is less personal sacrifice or scrutinization as far as boarding or any form of transportation.
I think that we all have to sacrifice in a post 9/11 world. I mean, I think that we're either at war or we're not at war. If we're truly fighting a war against radical Islam, I think we need to say so and figure out what tools are necessary to win that war. You know, we've just had another shooting incident in a high school setting. This one took place on an Indian reservation. And the more that I learn about the individual, we're not sure how many were involved, the more commonalities he seemed to share with those who were responsible for the incident at Columbine. I'm thinking of that whole so-called trench coat mafia mentality. Are we asking school administrators in moving forward to ignore warning signs in individuals who might dress in a similar fashion to those responsible in Columbine and this fellow responsible on the Indian reservation? Nobody would say that. I think everybody would say, well, wait a minute, if you have someone who bears some resemblance to the shooters in those incidents, just be extra attentive. That's all. And yet that same mindset doesn't seem to apply to the war on terror, and that's my complaint. I think what I'm advocating here goes on day in and day out in law enforcement. I have a brother-in-law who was assigned to Mayor Giuliani's protective detail, and before that, in the New York City police force, he worked in the Asian gang unit. The fact that they have an Asian gang unit in New York City told me that there's a problem in a particular segment of society, not among Asians, but there are some Asians who are gang members, and we need to be particularly attentive to them and understand them. It's the same mindset that I'm advocating here. Yes, sir.
I would guess that this type of profiling would have not have detected the Timothy McVeighs, the Unabombers, or the Ku Klux Klan type terrorist.
Nor Charles Manson. I've heard the question 100 times around the country.
And are you asking for a free license to this type of terrorism?
To the extent that there's a connection between those homegrown terrorists and there are commonalities between and among them, I would be. But there is none. I mean, there were those among us prior to 9/11, and unfortunately there will be those among us long after 9/11 who have no interconnection, but who are intent on committing acts of violence against the United States. I don't think it's a fair comparison. Normally I get the question of McVeigh and Nichols, the Columbine killers, and I always throw Manson into the mix because I know where they're headed. Those individuals haven't dedicated themselves in unison to a war against the United States the way that radical Islam has. That's the difference. Yes, sir.
I have a statement to, at the outset to say it. I don't expect to leave this world alive. Apparently you do. My second question is, have you heard about the Holocaust and about the internment of the Japanese in this country? And they were ethnically targeted. And you're doing the same thing right now.
And some would say for good reason. I would recommend to you that you take a look at the Korematsu line of cases that were litigated in the United States and read a book written by Michelle Malkin on the subject of the Japanese. If the premise of the question is to ask me to stand here and admit that the United States was wrong in World War II vis-a-vis the Japanese, I'm not prepared to do it. I've read too much on the subject. And so I think the premise is respectfully faulty.
Thank you very much for coming to Cleveland and sharing your remarks with us. I'm from the Council on American Islamic Relations, and I'd like to ask you, would you agree that Jose Melendez-Perez, when he was actually focusing on the person in question, he said he gave a stare, he had a scary look, he had no return ticket, no airline reservation, and his body gestures indicated to me that he might know military tactics or that his body gestures were somewhat suspicious. It looks like, and you might agree, I'm not sure, it looks like he was focusing on behavior, and I think most law enforcement officers tell you that profiling simply doesn't work. My question is this. If the hijackers were African American or black, would you dare to say the same things that you are saying now about African Americans? Just as, for example, when a white woman was whistled at, they would round up gangs of black people and test them to see if they were the ones that perpetrated that. Would you say the same thing? And don't you think that as an attorney, it's very dangerous what you're doing, because there's 1.2 billion Muslims in the world, and it would be very hard to profile them all? Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'm going to answer the question with respect to Yugoslavs, because that's half of my heritage. So I'll explain it this way. If 19 Yugoslavs on September 11 had committed the acts that these 19 committed against the United States, and if I, as a Yugoslav, now found myself subject to some additional level of scrutiny, I'd be upset. I hope that I'd be understanding of the circumstances that gave rise to that. You know, Michael Toohey is a man whose name, this is going to be cut 16, I had intended to get into, and I'll take that opportunity in answering your question right now. Michael Toohey is a man who for 34 years held the same job. His job was to work for U.S. Airways and its predecessor, Allegheny, I think, in Portland, Maine. And he would arrive at work at the Portland airport at 4 a.m. Every day in the course of those 34 years. He'll never forget what happened at 5:37 on September 11 when two individuals came to the counter. I'll let him describe it. I want to welcome to Philadelphia a gentleman named Michael Toohey. Mr. Toohey, good morning and welcome to our city.
Good morning.
Mr. Toohey, walk us through what transpired. It was early that morning, correct?
Yeah, it was actually, I can tell exactly what time it was. But it was about, when I spotted them, I was usually have a big rush of passengers first thing in the morning because we had like 5 or 6 flights going out within an hour-and-a-half period.
What time are we talking?
Oh, you're talking between 6 and 7:30. Just, the ticket counter was clear. There were several other agents on the counter, and it was clear, so I still have that bad cigarette habit. I was going to step outside to have a cigarette. But just as I was to step over the counter and go outside, I saw these two fellas standing there, and I said, "Are you on U.S. Airways?" And they nodded their head, and I said, "Well, come over here and I'll check you in." They stepped up to the counter, and then I took a direct look at them after I got settled, and I asked them the security questions, asked them if they were checking bags, and, well, just looking at them, when I asked them for their licenses, they both pulled out licenses and held them up in the air, and I just had a quick, brief thought in my mind, because I looked at their tickets, and they got one-way first-class tickets to Los Angeles, which is unusual. I mean, that sticks out. When you see a $2,500 ticket,
sure,
you don't see them every day. And then I looked up, to acknowledge them and ask them the questions, and one guy was looking at me. I mean, it sent chills through you. Something in your stomach just churns, and subconsciously, I said to myself, geez, if this don't look like an Arab terrorist, nothing does.
Mohammed Atta was the man he was looking at when he's describing that scenario. Now, the question becomes, should it be permissible for someone to take into consideration the one-way ticket, the cash for the one-way ticket? Yes, easy ones, right? To what extent should he, and he didn't, and he kicks himself to this day, and I've explained to him that to the extent he had taken action, U.S. Airways would have been on the receiving end of a fine. He walks around blaming himself in part for the events of 9/11. I believe that there needs to be the development of a list of all of these factors that would give rise to some level of secondary screening. I don't mind if my 9-year-old son continues to get singled out, as long as I know that it's no longer just window dressing, as the chairman of Southwest Airlines told me that it is. I'm willing to do my part. I just want some street smarts put back into this process that I think are terribly lacking. Do I have time for another? Okay, thank you very, very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland Forum, we've been listening to Mr. Michael Smerconish, radio talk show host and author of the book Flying Blind, How Political Correctness Continues to Compromise Airline Safety Post 911. Thank you, Michael, for your comments and for coming here today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Our forum now is adjourned. Thank you.